Content Advisory. This episode of Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom discusses a mass shooting with fatalities and its aftermath.
Hi, this is Lamar, and you're listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. A third space is a term that refers to a safe space for people to come together for respectful dialogue in a spirit of listening, sharing, and learning. In this podcast, we explore what it means to have third space conversations, and we try to model them. Getting to Third Space is produced by Tenacious Change, a consultancy committed to creating resilient, nonprofit organizations. If you like what you hear in this podcast, please be sure to subscribe, share it, and of course like it. The more people join us, the quicker we get to third space as a society. Now let's get to third space today.
We begin today with the Content Advisory. This episode of Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom discusses a mass shooting with fatalities and its aftermath. In our last podcast, we started a conversation with Lamar about the February 25th, 2016 mass shooting at Excel Industries in Heston, Kansas. Lamar was the Director of Human Resources at Excel, and his leadership role thrust him into the midst of dealing with the shooting and its aftermath on behalf of the company. That's what we discussed in our last podcast. Today, though, we're going to do a deep dive into the personal impact of the shooting for Lamar, his family, and his community. Heston, Kansas is largely a Mennonite community. Mennonites are a Christian sect which are often confused with the Amish because they share a religious history. Mennonites are one of three historic peace churches in the Christian tradition, the other two being Quakers and Church of the Brethren. Lamar and his wife Carla grew up in Mennonite families and raised their children in the Mennonite church. Excel Industries was also owned by a Mennonite family, and Heston College, a Mennonite school, was founded in the community in 1909. Knowing about these deep, pacifist Mennonite roots of Heston, Kansas is important for understanding and appreciating both the trauma of the event on the people of the community and also how they responded. If you haven't had a chance to listen or watch the previous podcast that tells the story of the shooting, we hope you'll do that before jumping into this one. It gives you important context for more fully appreciating this podcast. As we did in the last podcast, I'll be serving as the interviewer and Lamar will be in the guest role. Now, I've opened the door to the green room, not the green door, and Lamar will join us in a moment. Hey, Lamar. Thanks for
Tom,
coming
how you
through
doing?
that. Thanks for coming through both the green door and the green room there.
Yes. You know, I still didn't see the fruit basket. I'm sorry, man.
Oh, you didn't get that good. You didn't get the fruit basket, huh?
No. I mean, I get your Christmas cookies when you send them in the mail. I didn't see the fruit basket.
I'm sorry. Well, I'll have to work on that, I guess, but
Right.
she was so,
Uh,
oh my
like I said last
goodness.
time, I know what our budget is, so I get it.
You're very kind, my friend. You're very kind. Well, Lamar, I know you've had a chance to think a little bit
Yeah.
about our conversation the last time in which you told the story of the Excel shooting. And as we begin now, I'm wondering if you have anything more you'd like to say about it or anything you feel you need to clarify.
You know, a couple of things that we really didn't talk about is kind of how the employees over time, how that impact them. And I think, you know, there were 400 people there, but there were still thousands of people impacted um, because it's kind of a ripple effect. But I would say some very interesting things did come out. One is we had a lot of people, most people returned to work. There was just a handful who couldn't. Our applications increased dramatically right after the shooting, which I thought was interesting. There were no lawsuits related to the shooting, which I thought was very interesting. For the company, I think the big story for me that I take away is even with the facts that we were human, we didn't do everything perfectly. but I think our leadership's goal to take care of people made a difference. And I hold on to that. Um, I think that people appreciated the transparency, the good communication, the honesty, the taking care of people at the cost of the company, um, the messaging uh, that we had. Uh, I think all of that whole story makes a difference in how people themselves walk through their own traumatic situations. Not everything was perfect. Not everyone handled it the best, but I got to tell you, I was pleased that so many people did such a good job of walking through it and hanging in with the company.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you kind of put a point on some of that. I don't think I realized that no lawsuits came out of it. That you actually saw an increase in the number of people that wanted to work at Excel. I think when a company behaves in an ethical way towards people and does its very best, even under the most traumatic situations, um, yeah, people are going to want to be a part of that company. And it seems like Excel certainly behaved in that way. Well, in the last podcast, or in this podcast, we agreed that we'd focus more on the personal impact of the shooting. So let me begin with this question: how does something like this shooting change you?
Even though I knew that question was going to be asked, I take a deep breath. um, because it can't help but change you, right? Um, and I'm a big believer in the philosophy that we are a culmination of all of our experiences. Um, I think that's just who we are. So this is a huge part of my experience. Um, I think first of all, the emotional, psychological impact that it had for me personally. Um, you know, I was I would consider myself having had a traumatic experience. Part of what I didn't talk about in the story in the last episode was my role immediately following the shooting. Um, uh, I shouldn't say immediately, but about 10 o'clock that night, I was called back in by KBI into the facility. Had to dress up in all of their garb and walk through the same path that Cedric took as he was shooting people, which nothing had changed. All the bullet casings, all of the damage, all of the physical and people trauma was all still there. And walked it up to my office to gather data for KBI, personnel data, and realizing the bodies are still where they're at because that's all part of the crime scene. And I spent the next 2 hours sitting there beside that, within just a few feet of the guns and the bodies to pull data. To me, that was a very traumatic situation. Um, and that probably had the most impact on me, as well as um, it, realizing that in the role that I had, there was just very little that I could do. That helpless feeling. So emotionally, psychologically, I have my own triggers for trauma responses. And most of my trauma responses have dissipated over time. Um, I've got funny stories where they've come out. Walking through a parking lot with my wife, and somebody came out of a balloon shop, with a bunch of balloons, and they started bursting. I was down behind cars, which makes sense, right? It all fits. And those kinds of things, they're very real physically and um, psychologically, but over time I process through most of that. The nightmares are gone, all that kind of stuff. um, I don't go see movies um, because it's not. I don't feel it's a safe place to be, and I don't make a judgment on others that go see movies. But for me, I don't feel safe. Uh, the uh, I went with my wife to go see the movie Sully, which I really wanted to see. I'm a big Tom Hanks fan, and that's where he was a pilot who landed his jet in the Hudson River. Fantastic story, true story. But I didn't make it through the whole movie because after he landed, all the emergency vehicles showed up, all the lights, the sirens, and there's the scene that got to me was where he was walking. He was the last person on the plane walking through the plane to make sure everyone was out. And you could see this look on his face, which was exactly the look that I was seeing on our leaders' faces, with all the sirens and all of it. So that pretty much, I wish I could, I need to see the end of that movie. I don't know how it ends, but in that case, I don't, I choose not to do that. Go to movies just because it's an unnecessary thing for me to have to face. But most of the other things have psychologically and emotionally moved on. There are still times, anniversary dates. Um, I'll watch a television show, but probably the worst, to be honest with you, for me emotionally and psychologically, is when the next shooting happens, and I watch the coverage or I hear about it or I read about it, and it just transports me back to that time. Um, I know what those people are going through. I know what the leadership is going through, and the fear and the chaos, and uh, and then you and I from the outside, after a day or two, we're gone, right? We're on to the next thing. But I know that those people are dealing with an incredible amount of traumatic stuff. Um, I found myself, though, in my role, there was a lot of helpfulness and healing, being able to do things like help my team, and I don't say me, but my team, being able to help people with insurance, working with the state and funeral expenses, working with the families. I had contact with most of those families multiple times for quite a while. I at one point, about a year and a half later, took several family members and walked them through the plant and answered their questions basically, and showed them spaces that they felt they needed to finish some of their processing that they were working through. That was traumatic, but that was really helpful. Um, the wife of one of the individuals who was shot and killed. I called her maybe a year and a half later for something. I can't remember what it was, but I could tell she had been sleeping, and I said, "I'm so sorry I woke you up." She goes, "Lamar, your number's in my phone. Anytime you call, I am going to answer." And I just realized how important you are at that point to these people. She had no idea why I was calling. In fact, I can't remember why, but that's part of the roles that you play. So there's that part of the psychological, emotional side that changed me. I think I've also become very wary. Um, it's it when I go somewhere, I just know where exits are. I like to go to concerts, but I don't go to a whole lot just because of the whole thing with movie theaters. But I found a couple of venues that I'm comfortable going to, and I always get the same seats because I'm very comfortable in those seats. It's just one of those quirky things. Um, Now, how has changed my work, or the work that I was doing? I think it really was helpful for me to be able to see bigger pictures uh, of of the role of being a leader in a company or being a leader of a group. That while I've always known the job is to take care of people, now it takes on even a deeper meaning, not just for the people who are directly reporting to you or your company, but how many people that means. That means spouses, that means children, that means grandparents, that means parents. It also means I have responsibility to the community. I have responsibility to other workers. It's just a bigger picture for me than I think it ever was.
Mhm. So I've known you and Carla for many, many years, and I know your family is close. In fact, I've seen your family come into being, and I know that you're all very, very close. And at the time of the shooting, your two daughters were also living with their families in Heston. What was the immediate impact of the shooting on your family?
I wish I could be clear in my answers there. And part of it is my next 3 weeks were a blur. Um, from 4 o'clock in the morning till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. Um, my son, who was not here at the time, you know, talked with my brothers saying, "Hey, Dad's okay, but understand he's just really, really busy right now, and he's going to be hard to catch." And so that's kind of the way my life was. I know on the day of the shooting, both. So my wife's a therapist, clinical social worker, and at the time was working at the local mental health center, who was on lockdown because of the shooting. And my daughter, at that time, had her bachelor's degree in social work, clinical social work, and so they were they were. My wife was called in then through the agency she worked with, so she was actually on site that evening, as well as my daughter was, at this high school, which was just right across the street from Excel, as a staging place for families to meet with their employees so that they could get connected. Because remember, first of all, it's February, it's cold, right? It's also dark because it gets dark really quick. And so people left, they ran, but they had to leave their cars and their trucks. I mean, most people, the parking lot was full. That's all still part of the crime scene. People needed to connect with people, as well as people needed to know if their loved one was okay or not okay, because cell phone coverage was really difficult. The towers were flooded. There was just lots of communication difficulties. So my wife and my daughter were at the school, helping people connect, even with people who were unable to connect because either their family member was injured or they were killed. So it was a traumatic situation for them as well, at whatever level that turned out for them personally. Um, my my other daughter and her husband who live here, he was actually an employee at Excel at the time, but was on first shift and he had gone home. So he was at home at the time of the shooting. Actually, he was on the phone. I was talking with him when I was walking out of the building during the time of the shooting. So it's impacted us in our own stories about what it's done to our families. But I think we've come through it pretty well. We don't talk about it much, to be honest with you. Probably have talked about it with my son more than anybody, in part because he's been through his own trauma. He's worked some emergency situations that were very, very traumatic, involved little children and infants, and so he understood, and I understand kind of what we each go through when we uh, try to process what we've experienced. Um, I would say that most significantly is obviously my wife and I. I'm fortunate in that I live with a therapist. I think that works, right, for most cases. And I think she's been very gracious in helping me process through a lot of things, even even when I run out of the movie theater or hide behind a car when the balloons burst. But she helps me process and process anniversary dates, etc. So I think in that sense it's been a very helpful time for us to talk about things. And then finally, right before I retired or left Excel, um, and by the way, she was also on site in the facility for several weeks doing clinical work with employees, along with other people from the mental health services. But I walked her through the shooting process, so I could show her. I often say one of the things I don't miss about working in that facility is I knew where all the bullet holes were. I knew where people died. I knew where bad things were. Um, and it was helpful for me to walk her through and just kind of show her what my experience is. And then I think it also helped for me to explain the day to day because I continued to work there. That was in 2016. I just retired a little over a year ago. I continued to walk those same halls and those same paths, and I knew where all that stuff was at, and we tried to cover up. And I always found that to be uncomfortable. So anyway, a long way around to say, family-wise, I think we've done pretty well. I think I chose well with my spouse, and she's been very supportive and helpful for me there, as well as the rest of the family.
Well, I think that this was a couple of these questions in terms of, how the trauma impacted you personally, how it impacted your family. I think those are important questions in the time in which we live. So we know there is a term that is used when children are experiencing trauma. It's known as ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and yet at the same time, there are adverse adult experiences that we don't always necessarily recognize as clearly either. But when there is something that is this traumatic that happens, it has an effect on people, regardless of their age, regardless of their training, regardless of who they are as people, and that is something I think we tend to forget. As a country, we have perhaps become so used to violence and so used to trauma when it occurs that we forget that the people that human beings are affected by that trauma, and sometimes the effect is kind of funny, that diving behind a car when balloons go off in a parking lot, but in another way that's not funny, because that shouldn't be happening to a human being. That shouldn't be happening to somebody that they feel like they have to duck and cover because balloons are going off. And yet we know, and Lamar, millions of people across this country, because of all the violence that we've had in our country, have those kinds of reactions all of the time. And we have no idea, what sets it off or what triggers that for them. So I think it's important that what I appreciate about this is that, you are a highly trained professional. You're a psychologist. You have worked in many different situations where you have had to handle traumatic circumstances, whether in the counseling relationship when you were in student services at a college, or in this human resource role at Excel. And yet you also experienced the trauma. And I really appreciate you being willing to recognize that and talk about that, because then we don't ever want to normalize tragedy, but I think it is important that we normalize the fact that people are impacted by tragedy, so that people will do what they need to do to get the help that they need. Not everybody's fortunate enough to live with a therapist, but and Carla's a dang good therapist, but she is. But let's maybe broaden the lens out a little bit and talk about the community of Heston, Kansas. As I mentioned in the introduction, Heston is a mostly Mennonite community. Obviously, there are not everybody in the community is Mennonite, but certainly there's got to be a strong influence of the Mennonite faith within the community, and Mennonites are known as pacifists. So, what I'm wondering, how did all of that play into the community response to the XL shootings?
I would love to have that question asked to a panel of representatives in the community, to be honest with you. And maybe we'll see some of that in the article that comes out. I hope so, in Inc. magazine here in the next while. So I'll give you kind of my perspective. One of the strong attributes of the community has been historically the process of taking care of people who have been through traumatic situations, disasters, for example. And it's not just the Mennonite Church that does this; the Catholic Church does this as well. Other denominations do it as well. But the Mennonite Disaster Service has been a big part of what the church is about, as a way to express ways of caring for people who've been through very traumatic situations, mostly physical, building things. But all of that translates into building relationships and caring for the people who are trying to rebuild their lives, or to even care for people who are caring for people. Heston, a few years back, was hit with a tornado that took out a large section of the town. And so they've been through a disaster locally before. All that to say, I think one of the responses that was pretty evident is there was a desire to care for people, take care of people. During the shooting, there were employees who ran from the facility and ended up in church buildings, ended up in nursing homes here in the area, ended up in residences and in businesses, because it's a small town and you don't have to go very far to find any of these. And so they were looking to get away and be safe. And the people in those places took care of people. In addition to that, the community leaders from the from the mayor's office to the pastoral leadership, to the schools, to the college, and other businesses, stepped in a lot of different ways. One, there was a meeting every day uptown of what they called stakeholders, incident command kind of a scenario. So all these areas had representation there, as well as Excel. And I was part of that meeting. And the question always was, Excel, what do you need? How can we be helpful? Mr. Mayor, what do you need? And it was all about trying to build a logistical system that would meet the needs of people in the area. I found that process to be really helpful. One estimation is within hours after the shooting, there were over 700 emergency and law enforcement personnel who came on site. I don't know who came up with that number, but I've seen that number publicized more than once. So regardless, there was a lot of people here who are in some sort of support role or investigative role or protective role. And I know that there were a lot of attempts to take care of those people, whether it be by food or whether it be by arranging places for them to be or to meet. We're really good at feeding people, by the way. I mean, I think in most communities when there's trauma, people go to the refrigerator and what can we put together, or go to the cupboards. I think that's incredibly amazing. I think it's really helpful. And I know that there's always kind of this thing in a community like ours where, oh, if you want good food, that's where you want to go. Well, I know that law enforcement, we had on site our local police, several sheriff departments. We had the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. We had the Federal Bureau of Investigation here. We had I don't know. I'm sure I'm missing others who were here from law enforcement. We also had emergency services here on site for quite some time, and I know that these people uh, were fed well, both by local establishments as well as individuals. And that was one of their comments. Something I found interesting is because when you do that, you build relationships, and we are good at building relationships. And I think that's a part of how this community took care of each other and took care of itself is by the relationships. Even a year or so ago, a year or so later, I can't remember the exact timing, but there was a fundraiser for something in it's a golf tournament. And I know that the FBI out of Kansas City put together a team and sent a team down to play in the Heston golf tournament just because of their connectedness. I think that speaks well of the community's response, not just to victims, but also to everyone who's there taking care of people. A lot of money came in to the facility from across the world, a lot of and across the company, a lot of dealers for the company. We sold lawnmowers. A lot of dealers, a lot of vendors provided dollars for to go to the victims. Well, it took a creative approach. How do you get dollars to people who need it? And there was a local foundation that was able to help us work with the local church, was able to go jump through all the legal hoops needed to be able to get dollars to actual people. And that went on actually for several years. And I currently sit on that board because it was a board that I just so thankful was there when I needed their help from them to figure out how to do all of this. I think that there were a lot of victims who didn't live in this area, and I know the local churches reached out to those families, and a local pastor especially kept those relationships going for quite some time. So I think about a community living up to who they are, their faith, their values, how they live every day. I think they just turned the heat on and demonstrated how they can take care of not only themselves but the people in their area.
I'm wondering about the Mennonites' belief in pacifism. And of course, this was an incredibly violent situation. And I know you've been pretty connected to the Mennonite church there in Heston. How has this circumstance, how this shooting, how did that impact the pacifism that is held as being so dear to Mennonites in your community?
That's a really difficult question, but I'll give you my 2 cents on it, and maybe there are others who are listening who will add their thoughts. Maybe an example of kind of the conflict that this brings up. I was in a small group, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and a father of an employee who had actually been hiding during the shooting and was fortunate that the shooter turned left rather than right. But the father of that individual said to me in this group meeting, he said, Lamar, he says, I'm a pacifist. And I don't support, violence as a way to solve problems but I can't help but be thankful that the police chief shot and killed the shooter. That creates a conflict, right? And he was naming that. So I think that, yeah, there are, when you have a ethical and kind of theoretical belief system like pacifism, it gets challenged. And I think that it was challenged here in this community. I'm not saying it changed people's perspective, but I think it became very real. This isn't the only time it's been challenged. Um, you know, when you think of pacifism, there are some other maybe beliefs that are very similar. Non-resistance to violence would be another one, or nonviolence would be another one. They're not all the same. They're all very similar, though. How do you respond when there's a chance that more people are going to be killed in a situation if someone doesn't react violently to the shooter? So I know that conversation's happened multiple times in the community. I know there have been some articles written. I don't think there's an answer to it. I know that there was an article written by one of the professors from the college here in town, Mennonite College, that I thought made an excellent point, but it was a difficult one to swallow. That oftentimes, people like the shooter that we had, Cedric, oftentimes we don't think about where we have, and I'm going to use we in a much broader context, okay, where we have maybe failed people in providing the kind of services and support somebody needs, or getting people connected to what services are available in times where they're, distraught and can't find another way out. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying it was an interesting way to think it through. It's not about blaming anybody. So it's a bigger story for me than it is about nonviolence. We talked in the last podcast where I'm at on, maybe gun regulation, etc. And personally, I'm not at that point to say that, I think it should have ended differently. I think our event ended the best way possible in that particular moment. But there will be others who disagree with me because of their theoretical perspective on pacifism. So all that to say, and I'm not an expert in this theology or this theory at all. All that to say, it's not very neat. It's not tidy, and it makes us uncomfortable to talk about it. But it's an important thing when you're faced with it. I think people had to realize, what can we do to make a difference? We may not be able to figure this whole thing out on a nonviolence approach, but for me, nonviolence is always the best way to solve things if possible. That's kind of where I came out, and where I think I've always been.
Well, I'm wondering. We're at the point where we need to be winding down this particular podcast, and I'm sure this conversation will reappear at various times in the future. But as we wind it down for right now, I'd like to acknowledge that we have been able to go quite a bit deeper into the story of the XL shooting today and in the last podcast than we did in 2020. However, there's a lot of ways in which we've really only just still scratched the surface. Every time we talk about it, in fact, I hear something new that I didn't know before. And nonetheless, there are lessons that I know you've taken away from this experience. And as we were preparing for this podcast, you made a comment that stood out to me, particularly as it related to what we were trying to do with getting to third space. The gist of what you said is this: when dealing with traumatic situations, we have to use all of our tools to connect and work through difficult issues together. Would you like to say more about this now? Or also, are there other lessons learned that you can share with us?
I think what I'd like to say is, and I've said this multiple times in different ways, the tools that we talk about are really important and valuable tools in all conversations, particularly important conversations where we need to make decisions or work through issues or whatever it might be. From you and I conversing to, politicians in a room or international conversations that are happening. These are important tools and valuable tools. I think that what I worry about, Tom, more than anything is that people don't have these tools, or if they had them, they don't use them, and they tend to be more reactive, like in a shooting, or sad to say, there's another shooting this weekend, or in our politics, both locally and internationally. I think what interests me most when I think broadly is supporting people and encouraging people and trying to resource people who are willing to use tools that are immediately nonviolent. Let's go that direction, say it that way. And not reacting to threat, and not coming out in threatening ways, or this is my way or the highway, or this is what's going to happen to you if you don't follow my leadership. So I think my response right now is I'm hoping and hoping to influence people to think about ways to use good communication tools to solve problems, to create processes, to make a difference, and to go forward.
Well, when somebody says it goes without saying, they typically then go ahead and say it anyway. So I'm going to do that without saying it goes without saying. We are just a few months away from what could be an incredibly dangerous time for our country. However this national election turns out, there is wild possibilities for violence. And so I think part of what really spurred us on about a year ago to start this podcast is that we were looking towards the future and saying, if ever we've needed the skills and the ability for people to sit down and talk without resorting to violence, it is right now. And we are still moving towards a very contentious election season, and with the potential of violence from either side. Let's be honest, could be from either side. And so I join you with that wish that, people will be able to grab onto new tools and new ways of engaging with one another, and that they choose a nonviolent form of communication that allows them to try to hear and to understand and to speak and to be understood, so that potentially we could avoid some of the most dire consequences of a highly contested election in the coming months. So yeah, thank you for that. And Lamar, I know you and I we've talked about this XL shooting several times over the past 8 years, and I want you to know, though, that your friendship and trust are a real gift to me, as you have shared as much as you have about all of this with me. And of course, there is much we have talked about that is not in this podcast. And I appreciate your willingness to confide and share with me. And I know that even what we've covered in these two podcasts, it is not an easy conversation for you still. And I appreciate that you're willing to share more in this podcast, so that our listeners and our viewers can more fully appreciate the impact of gun violence in our world today, whether you are a non-gun owner like myself or a gun owner like you. there are real dangers. There's a real impact that gun violence has in our world today. As we noted previously, there are no easy answers to the whole thing around gun regulation, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying to find answers. So let me ask you this: you want to kind of do the wrap on this second one? You want to do the obligatory wrap?
I can do that, I think. No, go ahead, Tom. I'm going to turn it over to you because I don't have my notes in front of me.
You don't have that script, right? Okay, all right.
I don't have the script.
So in that case, I want to thank you for listening or watching today. And remember, we try to be responsive to suggestions from listeners. However, for us to be responsive to suggestions from listeners, we've got to hear from you. So there's a couple ways to be in touch. You can leave us a voicemail on Spotify. You can also make comments on YouTube. We do hold and moderate those comments before they go public, of course. And of course, we also both have emails where you can contact us. What's your email, Lamar?
My email is Lamar.
You're not going to escape this altogether. What is your email?
My email is lamar.thirdspace@gmail.com. And remember, third space is spelled with the numeral 3.
Yes.
Number 3.
Number 3. And mine is tom.thirdspace@gmail.com. And oh, what a surprise. Third is also just the number 3. RD space. Okay. So that'll be a wrap for us today. And again, thanks a lot, Lamar. You've been one of the most enjoyable guests we've ever had on the podcast.
I appreciate that.
All right. Hey, we'll see you soon at our next meeting as we plan going forward, and hopefully we hear from the author of the article that's coming out that we can record that podcast very soon as well. So,
all right. Take care.
All right. Have a good day. Tom here. Thank you for listening to Getting to Third Space with Lamar and Tom. Remember to click on subscribe to get notices about new episodes, and be sure to like and share the podcast as well. Opinions and ideas expressed in this podcast are solely those of Lamar Roth and Tom Klaus, and we'd like to hear your opinions and ideas too. You can leave us a voice message on Spotify, or you can email us at the addresses found in the show notes. Also, in the show notes, you can find links to some of the things we talked about today, so you can check them out yourself. Until next time, keep moving forward toward third space.